Stuart Cumella, Honorary Senior Lecturer at the School of Social Policy at the University of Birmingham. Are you okay with speaking?
I've got quite a loud voice. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
I suppose if you couldn't hear me, you wouldn't say yes. Right. I'm going to give a brief outline of the research that's being carried out on shared life communities, a term I use rather than intentional communities. I should emphasise this is based on a research briefing, about 12 pages of research briefing, that I hope you'll be able to access, and says what I'm saying in far more detail, and has some other studies you can follow up. If you try and look at the research, academic research, that's compared dispersed housing schemes, very little research has looked to date at shared life communities. Most research has compared dispersed housing schemes with hospital care, usually before and after resettlement. Only 2 studies have systematically compared the quality of life in shared life communities with other types of residence for people with a learning disability. One was carried out in the 1990s by what was the then Hester Adrian Research Centre by Eric Emerson and his colleagues, and there was a very similar piece of research carried out much more recently in the Republic of Ireland. Both used a wide range of standardised measures to compare residents in what they call village communities, dispersed housing schemes, and what were called hospital campuses. These were usually former NHS sites with a series of bungalows for different groups of people with a learning disability. There were very thorough research studies, and they produced very similar results. And I'll just summarise those briefly. They had very big samples. The Hark sample had 500 people living in very many different types of residence. The Irish sample was smaller, but by the standards of most research in learning disability, these are big surveys. They found the sample in shared life communities was the least physically disabled, and the people in hospital campuses were the most physically disabled. There was no difference between the 3 samples in the prevalence of mental illness or autism. A higher proportion of those in hospital had behaviour problems. It's important to see behaviour problems not as a diagnosis, but as a response to a particular set of living circumstances. What were the results? Well, they found the most homely accommodation and the least institutional settings were in village communities and in dispersed housing schemes. They found village communities were more likely than any other type of housing to involve residents in care planning, with an emphasis on vocational skills and education, improving people's skills. Strange contacts with professionals and regular health checks were highest in village communities, higher even than for the residents in NHS campuses. There was a wide range of costs for residents, but the highest costs were in hospital campuses. When the samples in the 3 different groups were matched for mental health and behaviour problems and severity of disability, village communities were the cheapest. Now this is a table, and I apologise for people, I didn't realise the room's going to be as big as this, so I apologise if you can't read this, but again, I'll just summarise it briefly. It's in the research briefing. What that did, they had a series of indicators of different types of quality of life, and they tried to identify which type of accommodation was best on each indicator. On individual choice, village communities and dispersed housing were best. On family contacts, numbers of contacts with family members, village communities were best. On social networks, people in village communities had higher rates of contact with staff and other people with learning disability, and dispersed housing had higher rates of contact with non-disabled people. And I should emphasise, these are quantitative studies. The quantity of friends you have is not a measure of the quality of friends you have. And the last presentation made that point, I think, very well. Physical activity rates were higher in village communities, and village communities were best for safety, for personal safety, and that's very important. We'll come to that later. Employment was highest in village communities as well. There were no differences between the different types of housing in terms of the satisfaction of the residents. So, to summarise, the results show the quality of life of people with learning disabilities is determined not by the size of the residence, but by what goes on inside it. It's what goes on inside the residence that matters in determining people's quality of life. And there's been very little research on the social relationships in residential care, and largely that's because of the problems you encounter in ethical committees if you try and carry out such research. There has been one study, which I was a participant, which looked at people in Bottom Village before they brought in all these various management changes, and that was a Campbell community which has been described by Dr. Van Dam. What we did when we interviewed these people, and this is a research paper which you can download, The people who live there like the diverse range of employment and leisure opportunities. Many people did 4 different types of work in a week. They like the wide friendship network with other people with a learning disability. And they had a sense of being part of the community in which they have an important part to play through shared decision-making and through participation in the rituals of life, which are a very distinctive part of Bottom Village, and I suspect other Campbell Village communities as well. It's worth asking why these results are so successful. What's right about shared life communities? First, I think a factor is the high level of meaningful employment. There's a lack of the barriers to formal employment, which is characteristically encountered by people with a learning disability living in small houses dispersed through urban areas. They can't get the jobs, so they don't take part in any kind of employment. People in Bottom Village were employed most of the time in a variety of work they found interesting. There are opportunities for friendship. This is facilitated by the availability of several other people with a learning disability and by the sense of personal security that's available in the village community. And finally, there's long-term relationships. Living in an extended family, which is the mode of care, the mode of life in shared life communities, enables people with a learning disability and their supporters to acquire skills in each other's pattern of communication. And that's the essential step if a person with a learning disability is to learn of the world and express choices about what they want to do in it. Long-term relationships with staff may now be less common in dispersed housing schemes because of cost pressures. A high proportion of staff now in dispersed housing schemes are on minimum wages and there's a very high turnover. Conclusions. Shared life communities are therefore an appropriate option for people with a learning disability who prefer this lifestyle. This is a quote from Professor Emerson's research carried out, as I said, some time ago. Given that dispersed housing schemes and village communities appear to be associated with different patterns of benefit, people with intellectual disabilities should be free to choose between these 2 options. So we should therefore avoid the social engineering fallacy, the idea that's been very common in policy making in this country, that if we find one type of provision is better on average for a group of people, then all the people in that group should be forced to live that kind of life. And the implication is we should therefore, public agencies in the decisions they make to assess, commission, fund and regulate residential support should respect the choice of individual people with a learning disability. And that's enshrined in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. And if you're going to have choice, choice means you have a diversity of things to choose between. It doesn't mean that you've got a choice between several things that are all the same, several different types of house down ordinary streets. It includes the choice to live, if you should wish, in a shared care community such as provided by Camden and by Larch. That's all I have to say. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. That's great. Our next speaker is Sally Jones. Sally